We're joined now by the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Kristina Keneally, and I want to talk to you about this issue. You're giving a speech on tonight at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. ASPI is focusing on right-wing extremism, and of course it's something we need to look at in the context of Brenton Tarrant, the Australian who committed that atrocity in New Zealand. Is there enough focus on this area?
Kieran, there isn't, is the short answer. You know, Mike Burgess in February made clear in his first annual threat assessment that the right-wing extremist threat in Australia is real and it is growing and it is capable of carrying out a terrorist attack. But we are behind. We are quite far behind. We haven't even had a proper conversation about the extent to which Brenton Tarrant was radicalised here in Australia by the right-wing extremist groups in this country. We are quite far behind other like nations as well. We're the only Five Eyes country that has not listed a right-wing extremist organisation as a terrorist group. Canada, New Zealand, the United States and the United Kingdom all have listed groups. Some of those groups have branch groups in Australia. We haven't even taken that step yet. To list any particular organisation as a right-wing extremist
When you
group.
say we don't know the extent to which that mass murderer was radicalised in Australia, is that in terms of public knowledge? Presumably the agencies would know.
We haven't had a proper conversation in this country about the extent to which Brenton Tarrant was talking to and engaging with various right-wing extremist groups in Australia. And we know he was having some conversations. We don't know the extent to which that contributed to his radicalisation. We also don't know the extent to which some of the more mainstream ideas may have encouraged him. We have to acknowledge, Kieran, that there's an easy slippage between some of the mainstream concepts that are generally quite positive, say patriotism or being pro-family or proud of your ethnic background. I consider myself to be all three. But in the hands of right-wing extremists, those generally positive constructs can become divisive tools to fuel darker, racist, anti-immigrant, fascist views.
So what needs to be done then in a broader sense to try and combat this? If Mike Burgess, he's obviously right, he monitors this activity and says that the groups and the numbers are growing, what needs to be done to combat that? Is there anything that can be done in terms of a public policy sense?
Well, we need some national leadership on this because what we do know is that the best form of prevention is to stop radicalisation before it occurs. Now, the Department of Home Affairs has spent in the past few years about $53 million on countering violent extremism programs. It's unclear if any of that has gone towards right-wing extremism. Most of that most likely has gone towards countering jihadist extremism, which remains an ongoing threat to Australia. But we can't lump all extremist views into one category and say one size, one approach fits all. When we're dealing with right-wing extremism, we are dealing with a more diffuse group of people and a more fluid ideology, and the efforts to prevent radicalisation will require a coordination between federal and state government, civil society like schools and churches and sports clubs. It will also require engaging with social media and the mainstream media, which have a serious role to play here.
In that speech tonight, as I said, with ASPI, a couple of other issues before you go. I want to ask you about this situation in Melbourne. What went on with the Australia Post and that public housing tower? Rob Harris had a very interesting story today in the Herald and the Age that the Australia Post threatened to contact the police if One Nation beer coolers weren't delivered. What on earth?
I'm sorry, that is the craziest sentence, I think.
It is. It's the craziest story.
It's an insane story, a wild story. Well, we don't know what went on there. And let's be clear. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, let's call it a duck. This looks like a quid pro quo between Australia Post and One Nation. Australia Post delivering beer coolers or beer holders for One Nation in order to secure their vote in the Senate against to preserve Australia Post's position to carry out their cuts. Now, Labor opposed those cuts. Labor kind of is quite frankly flummoxed.
So does the
here
chief executive?
By what's going on with
does
the
the chief executive need to be held accountable for this weird intervention?
She does. The government should get out. Paul Fletcher, the Minister for Communications, and the Chief Executive need to get out and explain this, because it looks like a quid pro quo here for a senator's vote. But let's be clear, if they don't, Senate estimates, no doubt, is going to take a very serious look at this.
And on this tragic situation in Queensland, a 26-year-old unable to attend the funeral, would you urge Premier Palaszczuk to intervene on cases like that?
Look, I just want to say, Kieran, my heart goes out to this family. This is obviously a terrible situation for them and at a very difficult time. And, in my professional capacity as the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, I get a lot of heartbreaking stories like this one come to my office. COVID has separated families, and it's a tragic consequence of this. So I think we need
There's no logic, though. There's no logic in that decision. I heard Jeanette Young's news conference. It did not make sense. Saying, there's, COVID threats. There's no COVID-19 in the ACT. She's dealing with cases up there.
Karen, I have to say, and I don't want to get into tit for tat, this government, that government, but I've seen a lot of quite questionable decisions that have no logic come through our office, where people have been denied permission by Australian Border Force to leave the country only once they've had a second look to make a more compassionate and considered decision. All of our governments are trying to do the right thing here and keep their communities safe, but we need to make sure that people aren't unjustly and unfairly disadvantaged at what is obviously a very personal and distressing time.